Good evening. My name is Barbara Rickoff, Associate Dean for Curriculum and Programs, and on behalf of Dean Jennifer Miller, I would like to welcome you to the DePaul University College of Education Spring 2025 Education Issues Forum. Tonight's topic, immigration policies impacting our schools and students, is an important one to all in our college, whether you are a student, faculty member, or staff. Your presence here tonight signals your commitment to better understanding current policies regarding students' rights, as well as ways to advocate for students and their parents. Thank you for attending this session and for supporting your students and their well-being. At this time, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Sonia Soltero. She serves as professor and chair of the Department of Leadership, Language, and Curriculum. She is the president of the University Faculty Council, co-founder and co-chair of the English Language Advocacy Council in Higher Education, and a member of the Executive Board of Directors of the National Association of Bilingual Education. Welcome, Dr. Soltero.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rickoff, for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're thrilled to have over 450 participants registered for our event tonight, including the DePaul community, faculty, and students from other universities, pre-K-12 educators and educational leaders, community and state organizations, and others. It's a real testament to the widespread interest in and concern about the current immigration climate affecting communities and educational institutions across the country. I also want to take a moment here to point out that this is the 14th year of DePaul's quarterly forums that Dr. Diane Horowitz has organized. The forums have tackled a huge variety of important educational issues critical to understanding our role as educators and counselors. So a big thank you to Diane for her amazing work on this front for over 14 years. Just want to share a word about this evening's format. I will begin by providing the context for tonight's forum, which will be followed by our feature speaker, Lubna Alam, and then engage in a conversation with each of our two panelists, Rachel Esposito and Gabriel Paez. And then that will be followed by a questions that we will take from the chat for each of the speakers. And so feel free to put questions in the chat. And while we will only have about 15 minutes to answer questions, we will try to get to as many as we can. And with that, I'd like to begin by saying a few words. As everybody, the entire world knows, Pope Francis passed away today, or early last night. And because Pope Francis was a staunch, long-time defender of immigrants across the world, and tonight's forum is on immigration and on this topic, I would like to begin by quoting our university president, Robert Manuel's message to the DePaul community on Pope Francis passing today. And this is what our president at DePaul said. As a Catholic and Vincentian university, we felt a deep spiritual resonance between Pope Francis and our patron, St. Vincent de Paul. Both lived as reformers, affirming the sacred dignity of those most in need and seeking out those on the margins of society. Their examples challenge us to be more faithful, more just, and more loving. Through his example of hope and mercy, Pope Francis urged us to listen deeply, welcome the stranger, and protect the most vulnerable among us. Again, listening deeply, welcoming the stranger, and protecting the most vulnerable among us. His teachings on integral human development called us to see the profound connection between our care for the earth and our care for one another. His vision for the world was rooted in compassion, justice, and the flourishing of all people. And with that, I wanted to open this session on the issues surrounding immigrant policies that affect those that are most on the margin. So the focus of this evening's forum is centered on just that, and the current administration's harsh immigration policies and enforcement impact, and how that impacts schools, students, families, and communities. It is really critical and important to first understand the demographics of the United States, and the scale and the impact of these policies. Per the current population survey in January 2025, there were approximately 53 million, or 60% of the total US population, that were immigrant. 3/4 of all immigrants in the United States are legally here. It's important to note that. And almost half are natural citizens. I am one of those. Latinos are the largest immigrant group, followed by immigrants from Asia. In Illinois, Latinos make up 18% of the state's total population, with 2,034,000 people, while Asians make up around 6% in Illinois, or about 750,000 people. The Chicago Latino population is about 820,000, almost 30% of the city's total population, while the Asian population is around almost 200,000, accounting for 7% of the Chicago residents. So it is undeniable that immigrant communities across the country, across the state, and in our city are significant and important to both the society and to our economy. The current administration's harsh immigration policies and the looming threats of being detained and deported without due process have profound effects on students and families, all of which create serious barriers to their education and their psychological well-being. The current climate has inevitably resulted in a myriad of negative consequences, like absenteeism, decreased academic performance, decline in family involvement, social isolation, and student disengagement from school activities, and a lot more. So it is really important to note that this fear goes beyond those who are themselves undocumented and extends to the members of mixed status families who live in a chronic state of anxiety, uncertainty, and emotional distress that a loved one at any time, a loved one in their family, may be apprehended and deported. So to illustrate the severity of the government's policies and actions, I will mention just a few examples of what they are in the last 2 weeks. Increased immigration rates by ICE and DHS, targeting undocumented immigrants, no matter how long they have lived in the US and have no criminal record. Even people with lawful status, including those who are US citizens, can be detained if they can't prove resident status on the spot. Rapid deportations without hearing or due process, like the recent planned mass deportations to El Salvador of immigrants primarily from Venezuela, who without a determination of criminal activity or immigration status were slated to be deported. Reduce local protections by blocking sanctuary city and state policies, including Chicago and Illinois. Current administration plans for mass-scale expansion of ICE and for-profit immigration detention camps that lack the most basic standards of hygiene, shelter, food, water, and medical attention. Contracts worth up to $45 billion have been awarded to private companies to operate these new facilities. Plans to end DACA, plans to end US refugee admissions programs, and temporary protected status, including immigrants from Haiti and Venezuela, and naturalized citizenship, plans to end birthright citizenship, which is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment and has been in place since 1868. While many executive orders and actions have been challenged in courts, some temporarily being halted, others allowing them to move forward, the threats to due process and the Constitution continues. With these realities in mind, we move to our featured speaker, Lubna Alam, who I'm honored to introduce as our first distinguished speaker for tonight. Lubna Alam is an attorney at the National Education Association Office of General Counsel. NEA is the nation's largest labor union and professional association, which represents public K-12 educators across the country. At NEA, Lubna works on federal education law, labor and employment issues, and civil rights issues. Lubna also co-leads NEA's cross-departmental immigration team. She's a graduate of St. Louis University and the University of Michigan Law School. Lubna, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with my PowerPoint here. So, okay. Great. So as she mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a few different things today in my presentation. I am going to be speaking about providing first an overview of who immigrant students are, along with the policies that the new administration has put in place regarding schools and policies that will impact, our students and our families. Then I'll be speaking about the legal framework that exists to protect immigrant students at schools. And finally, I'll be discussing how schools can respond to protect their students and communities. So just a quick disclaimer at the very beginning, I will be providing general guidance here in this presentation, and it is not legal advice tailored to your specific situation. For legal help, please make sure you consult a qualified attorney. So the first thing when we talk about immigrant students at school is really thinking about who are these immigrant students. And one thing to note is that quite a few US citizen children are part of immigrant families. And even though they're US citizens, because of the fact that they're in immigrant families, they are also being impacted by the current administration's increase in immigration enforcement. So 4.4 million children are US citizens who live with at least one undocumented parent, and 6.1 million children live with an undocumented family member. So these policies that impact undocumented individuals that lead to this increased immigration enforcement, they harm these mixed status families, and they can harm the US citizen children within these families as well. So it is not just undocumented children who suffer the consequences of increased immigration enforcement. Some other specific categories of immigrant students include, of course, undocumented students. These are students who came to the US without legal documentation, or perhaps they did enter with a legal status such as a visa, but then overstayed that visa. This is a racially and ethnically diverse group of students from all over the world: Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe. And oftentimes they do not know they are undocumented until it is time for them to apply to college. And sometimes that is when a student realizes that they are undocumented because they're not able to fill out certain forms. They are not able to apply for certain scholarships because of their undocumented status. And nearly 100,000 undocumented students graduate from high school every year in the United States. Another category of immigrant children is what is referred to as unaccompanied children. And unaccompanied children is actually defined by US law under federal statute. And what this is a child who arrives in the United States and is under 18. They do not have legal status, and they do not have a parent with them or a guardian with them or available in the United States that's available to provide care and physical custody for these children. Sometimes there are specific types of statuses that unaccompanied children can adjust into depending on some family circumstances. But, these are children who often have to stay in the custody of other relatives or be released into the custody of others because they do not have a parent or guardian in the United States. And the numbers of these children, unaccompanied children, really began increasing about a decade ago. And many of them coming from Central and South America. And finally, another category of immigrant children are refugee children. And refugee status is a status that is granted to individuals who are located outside the United States, and they are unable or unwilling to return home because they fear serious harm. And so when they are outside the United States, they can apply for admission as a refugee to the United States. And there are a very, very limited number of these refugee admission slots, and a family can be granted the status and then can come to the United States with the legal status of a refugee. And quite a few of these refugees who are admitted to the United States are children. Between 2010 and 2020, about 31% of refugees admitted were children under the age of 14. And so now talking about some of the current policies of this administration that impact these various groups of students and their families that we talked about, immigrant children and families. And first and foremost, and I think a policy that many people might have heard of, was the ending of the sensitive locations protections that protect schools from immigration enforcement. Now, this was a policy that has been in place for decades. It was first put in place in 1993. And in 2011, it was codified into a memo. It was a DHS sensitive locations memo that codified this policy. And then it was expanded in 2021 by the Biden administration to cover more locations as a sensitive location. And what this policy essentially said was that at certain locations, including schools, hospitals, places of worship, places where children gather, including childcare centers or playgrounds, that there should be no ICE arrests, interviews, or searches in order to make these places where children and families feel safe to go, such as a hospital to receive medical care, to court to, testify in a criminal case, and of course, to schools to receive an education. Unfortunately, on the very first day of the Trump administration, the Department of Homeland Security withdrew this memorandum. And so now there is no longer a general policy in place saying that there will not be immigration enforcement at schools. And now instead, ICE agents are directed to just use their discretion and common sense about whether or not to engage in ICE arrests, interviews, and searches at places such as schools and hospitals. So understandably, the withdrawal and termination of this memorandum has led to quite a lot of fear and confusion and concern about the risk of increased immigration enforcement at school. There have been several lawsuits challenging the rescission of this policy. However, all three there's three lawsuits, two of which concern religious institutions and the protections for religious institutions, and one lawsuit that involves schools. Unfortunately, in the schools lawsuit, their request for a temporary restraining order against the policy was not granted. So the litigation in that continues. Some other policies that impact schools and school communities and the children who attend school. Dr. Soltero spoke about some of them at the very beginning of the presentation, but one is that refugee resettlement agencies have been ordered to stop supporting the refugees who are currently in the United States. So these are families that have been admitted to the United States, and generally what happens is there are refugee resettlement agencies that assist these families in locating housing, finding jobs, helping them enroll their children in school, because often these are people who were not planning to leave their country, were not planning to come to the United States. And so, helping them navigate life in this new country, along with financial support for them for several months until they're able to find jobs and get on their feet. However, these agencies have been told to stop doing all of that support work. And a number of those, I think, organizations, I think many people know are Catholic organizations like Catholic Charities, and quite a few refugee resettlement agencies. There have been attempts by this administration to revoke a number of lawful statuses that people have, included temporary protective status for people from Venezuela, Haiti, and other countries, the termination of parole programs, such as the CHNV parole program for individuals from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, parole programs for Ukrainians, for people from Afghanistan, quite a number of these programs, all of which, the revocations of which have been challenged in court. I think all of us have been hearing about the student visa revocations of students who, have lawfully entered in the country, are on student visas, and then they're suddenly finding out that their visas have been revoked, and people are being kind of scooped up off the street by ICE because they had no information or knowledge that their visas have suddenly been canceled by the U.S. government. And an overall increase in immigration enforcement. We're seeing more raids, more individuals being arrested, for ICE enforcement for individuals who previously there was not a priority to have immigration enforcement for people without criminal records, families, people with jobs. But now we are seeing individuals such as that being taken by ICE and being the subject of immigration enforcement. So that's kind of some of the policies that we're seeing in place from the current administration. And so now I'm going to talk about some of the legal framework that protects immigrant students in schools. The first and most important is, of course, the landmark Supreme Court case of Plyler versus Doe, which recognized the right of all children, including undocumented children, have a constitutional right to a free public education in K through 12. This was a 1982 decision, and it basically held that states cannot withhold funding for K through 12 education for undocumented students. They cannot charge tuition to the families of undocumented students, and they cannot allow, and school districts are not allowed to deny enrollment to children based on their immigration status. And part of the Plyler line of cases and the case law that is evolved from that is, in addition to all of that, that school districts also cannot take actions that chill the enrollment or participation of undocumented students in school. So, for instance, asking for immigration documentation, requiring that as a condition of enrollment would be a violation of Plyler versus Doe, because that would be an action that chills enrollment of students and chills their families' participation in the school. Another important law is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. This is a federal law that protects student records and student information. And under FERPA, school districts cannot disclose personally identifiable information in a student's education records without caregiver consent. So information about the student cannot be disclosed. The exception to that, a somewhat significant exception, is that school districts can disclose something called directory information without consent. Directory information that school districts have are things like the student's name, their address, what sports teams they might play on if they're in high school, et cetera. And so school districts are required to inform families that they can opt out of being included in the directory information and the disclosure of directory information. So it's important that school districts inform families of that if they would feel more comfortable not having that information disclosed, and also recommend that school districts not include place of birth information in their directory information, because since that is information that can be disclosed publicly, it could also potentially be used for immigration enforcement purposes. The other major exception, of course, to the privacy of student records under FERPA is if there is a judicial order or subpoena requesting the information. If a school district is faced with a judicial order or subpoena for this information, then of course they have to comply with those judicial orders and disclose that information, and that can be done. That has to be done pursuant to the court order. Another important protection that schools have and that all of us have is the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Under the Fourth Amendment, law enforcement is required to have a warrant signed by a judge, not just an administrative warrant issued by their own agency, in order to investigate or detain a person who is in a location where he or she has a reasonable expectation of privacy. So that would include your home, where you have a reasonable expectation of privacy, and that also includes private areas of a school. So for instance, I think we all know that in most public schools, anybody can't just walk off the street, wander the halls of a school building. You can't just wander into a classroom and just sit in a classroom. That's not how it works. People have to check in, sign in. There's policy, protocol about whether or not individuals can come into these other areas of a school, the non-public areas of a school where the children are in class or are gathered. And so it's the same thing with respect to law enforcement agents. They are not just allowed to come into school freely. There is a Fourth Amendment requirement here that school districts can make sure is abided by in their school district policies. And finally, there's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, discrimination based on race, color, or national origin is prohibited in schools that receive federal financial assistance. So if there is bullying or harassment of students based on their national origin, based on, potentially their immigration status, that could violate a student's civil rights, and schools are obligated to respond to that bullying and harassment and protect those students from that. So, I think we've We all know, we're all aware of the increase in immigration enforcement, and Dr. Saltero did speak about what the impact of that has been on students, and some of those impacts are described here as well. Of course, there's increased absenteeism, where families are afraid to send their children to school because, especially with the rescission of the sensitive locations protections, parents are afraid that there might be ICE at school, or that there might be ICE enforcement when they come to pick up or drop off their children, or at bus stops and things like that. So there is, and we've been hearing from our members, from our NEA members, from educators across the country, that they are seeing this increase in absenteeism, the decreasing numbers of children coming to school. And it also leads to decreased student achievement and parental disengagement in the school community. There's overall very negative physical and mental health outcomes for children in immigrant families when there is increased immigration enforcement in their community. And when you have a decline in school enrollment, of course, that could also impact school funding, which is often determined on a per pupil basis. So we are aware of all these negative impacts that can occur to students and to the school community because of this increased immigration enforcement. And of course, the question is, what can schools do? How can schools respond to this and protect their students and their school community? So here in Illinois, the Illinois State Board of Education has actually issued a really great guidance document. It was issued in mid-January, pretty quickly after the rescission of the sensitive locations memorandum. And it provides a list of guidance for school districts to do with respect to immigrant students and immigration enforcement. First, it reminds schools of their obligations to not inquire about citizen status of students or parents, or to require proof of citizenship for enrollment. It also encourages school districts to create a policy about how the school district will respond to immigration enforcement at school. It also encourages school districts to have a point person for ICE personnel, where ICE personnel can be directed, as well as a point person to review any records requests from ICE. And also to have policies and procedures in case a student's parent is detained or deported. And so, what could that policy potentially look like? How would that policy work? And NEA, we have a model safe zones resolution that we have drafted back during the first Trump administration, and hundreds of school districts adopted it across the country during the first Trump administration. And, many more were adopting it even after that. And of course, now the school districts that hadn't adopted them are now adopting this NEA model safe zone resolution, or things that are similar to that now. The NEA model safe zone resolution is based on the legal framework I just laid out at the beginning. It's based on Plyler, FERPA, and the Fourth Amendment, as well as Title VI. And it does a few key things in the model policy. It reaffirms, of course, that all children have a right to attend public school, regardless of immigration status, and prohibits the school district from collecting immigration information. It also establishes the procedure for how to respond to immigration enforcement on campus, along with establishing who the point person is to review these ICE requests. And it asks the school districts to create a rapid response team if a student's parent or guardian is detained by ICE. There's a number of other provisions in our model safe zones resolution. You can see the language here, the link here to go to that. And so, as I mentioned, hundreds of school districts have adopted this policy, and it's a great policy for your school district to adopt if it does not have a policy like this in place already. So, highly recommend going to that, checking to see if your school district has one, and if not, to adopt a policy like this. And safe zone policies work. I mean, they work in having a policy in place for how school districts should respond if ICE comes to school. I know there have been instances, including in Chicago, where school districts have successfully followed this policy and ensured it was followed. And as a result of that, there was not ICE enforcement at the school. And it also has been associated with better academic outcomes for children who had experienced or were at risk for parental deportation, according to a 2022 study in the Journal of Migration Studies that is linked here. So it's I think, a very effective policy that we highly encourage your school districts to adopt. And there is so much more to discuss on immigration issues and enforcement generally, but we also have some other wonderful panelists who are going to be talking. So I did just want to share this link here for a variety of NEA resources on immigration issues. It's basically a fairly comprehensive guidance document. We talk in the guidance document, it kind of gives a 101 and immigration in schools, talks about what types of documents, for instance, you can ask students for at enrollment, since you cannot ask about citizenship documents, for instance. It talks about immigration enforcement at schools, kind of goes in detail about what a safe zone policy should have. It also goes into detail about what you should do if your school does not have a safe zone policy, and then how you should respond. It also contains a variety of know your rights guides, including a know your rights guide for immigration enforcement, know your rights with respect to mass raids, if there is a raid in your community, and what could occur as a result of that. And of course, there's information about the safe zone policy and sample and FAQs about how to adopt that. Of course, we recommend bringing it up to your school board and having your school board adopt it as a school board resolution. So we have a lot of questions, answers to questions about that. And finally, we also have a separate guidance related to issues about higher education. My presentation is focused on K through 12, but of course there are a lot of issues with respect to immigration enforcement in higher ed. And so we have a separate guidance document that answers those questions, including a model safe zones resolution for higher ed universities and colleges, because of course the legal parameters around the protections is slightly different. Colleges and universities, as you all know, have much more public space where ICE enforcement could occur. So in the higher ed guidance, we talk about, the importance of universities establishing, for instance, what's public space and what's private space, and considerations such as that. So the link to all those resources is listed here, as well as you could use the QR code and take the QR code. It'll link you straight to those resources. So thank you all so much. I know I covered a lot of information very quickly, but I wanted to make sure there was enough time for all of our other speakers. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen now. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Many thanks for your very timely and informative, so informative, your presentation and your insights. Extremely important for all of us to know and understand the laws relevant to immigrant protection and rights, due process rights, and our own rights as educators, leaders, and counselors. Thank you so much. And just talking about higher education, we just learned, came through a notification for me that Harvard has sued the current administration. And so perhaps the courts are the ones that are going to litigate the rights of public education and even private education, especially at the higher ed level. Just as a reminder, if you can please, those of you who are on with us tonight, if you can please feel free to put questions in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as possible in the 15 minutes or so that we have at the end of the forum. And with that, it's a real pleasure to introduce our two panelists, Rachel Esposito and Gabriel Paez. And we'll start with Rachel, and then I will introduce Gabriel after we have a conversation. Rachel Esposito is a field service director working for the Illinois Federation of Teachers. She works with educators and support staff in early childhood through high school districts in the western suburbs to advocate and represent them in matters including collective bargaining, organizing, and mobilizing. Prior to becoming a field service director, she was a middle school language arts teacher for 19 years in Cicero, Illinois. She was a union council president for 8 years, served as the president of Local 571 West Suburban Teachers Union, and is a vice president of the Illinois Federation of Teachers. Rachel is also, proud to say, is an alum of DePaul University College of Education. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. And let's get started. Can you tell us a little bit about the Cicero community, where you taught and where you serve teachers now? And what is your sense of the impact of the administration immigration policies on the community?
Thank you very much for your introductions. I appreciate that. So as you mentioned, I was a teacher for 19 years in Cicero. I worked in the junior high as a language arts teacher. And I was a teacher during the first Trump administration. And to talk a little bit about the community, first, this is a 95% minority community, Title I school. So almost all students, qualified for free and reduced lunch, very high immigrant population. And, the students, because of a lot of the reasons that were just mentioned, the students don't come out and necessarily always say what their immigration status is or that they're struggling with some of the things that are going on politically or socially around them. So sometimes you have to be intuitive and be connected with the students so that you can understand what they're dealing with, because you may only see some of the surface things and not really understand that they're living with an uncle because their parents are still in another country, that they are citizens but their parents may not be, and so the blend that is definitely a factor when you are working in communities, and that could be anywhere in Illinois, not just in the city or near the city, out in the western suburbs as well. We see this having an impact. As I was saying, I was a teacher during the first Trump administration, and the day after he was elected, I had a group of students who wanted to talk to me and stayed after class and were crying in class, crying about they weren't sure what that meant for them, considering the rhetoric that was out there at the time. This is a predominantly Latino community, and so they were very concerned about some of the comments that Trump was making about Mexicans and the way he viewed them, and they felt very much like their status was in danger. And now, fast forward, now that I represent the high school in the Berwyn-Cicero area as a field service director, and we saw a lot of students stop coming to school for a period of time, especially when all the ICE and the different raids were going on, especially when we learned that schools maybe were not such a safe place anymore. We saw a lot of students not coming to school, and struggling with what was going to happen in the future. I think I also, as a representative, had a lot of council presidents, unions reach out and say, what are we going to do when this happens? So there was a lot of questions out there about, for example, what happens when a parent is taken and a student has nowhere to go. And so trying to give parents the resources, who are also afraid to come into the buildings because of the dangers that may be there, waiting for those parent-teacher conference nights to show up, and try to do some kind of raid. So it's important that when we are educating our parents, to give them multiple opportunities as well as off school grounds, to give them some opportunities to educate themselves so they know what they need to do to prepare in case something does happen.
Very serious consequences for parents and families who already come to school without understanding, or having a clear understanding of the culture of schooling in the United States, and language barriers and other barriers. And this is one more that leaves them very vulnerable.
Absolutely. Parents look at schools as a safe haven for their students, for their kids. A lot of times it's the place where they get their 2 meals a day and their basic needs met. But then to add this stress on, it becomes sometimes unbearable.
It is truly unbearable. So give us this view from the classroom, and can you share some stories of how students are responding? What are the issues you and teachers that you talk with have faced in working with undocumented students and other students from mixed status families, newcomers? And how do you all deal with these concerns? How do you respond? And attempt to help.
Yeah. I think, I've heard a lot, when you teach, there's still hope. And so I see a lot of hope in our students, a lot of students that want, especially in the older students, wanting to get involved and wanting to, try to make changes. So that really gives me hope for the future. And I think that teachers, especially, we're very concerned when we see Trump come in for the second term, and a lot of the rhetoric that was out there about schools not being safe places. And so now what do we do to protect our children? I think that, the majority of teachers had conversations with students to say, listen, if ICE is coming in, I'm not letting them in. You're safe here. So teachers having to make some real, had to show their dedication to their students, that they were not going to back down if there was, if ICE were to come to the door. So that puts a lot of strain on teachers and on staff members. And so they very much wanted to know what their rights were, how far can we go? What can we do to try to save our students, but also make sure that we're working within the confines of the law. So a lot of education had to happen very quickly. I think the other thing that, as was mentioned before, some really great ideas with working with school board, because school boards, are really important. I don't think people realize how important school board elections are. School boards are, a group of community members that are making decisions for hundreds, if not thousands of students and parents and families. So getting involved in your local school board races is really important because you want to make sure that you have the right people in place, so that you can make sure that when it comes time that they're going to stand up for, the values of a community. I think I have found, dealing with different districts around the western suburbs, some districts were a lot more willing to make a statement and start moving on school board policies to protect our students, while other school boards were more reluctant, and still are reluctant to put out a message about where their stance is as far as protecting students and all of that. They say, well, there's these laws in place and that's what's in place. But a lot of times what matters is what you tell the community and what face you're putting out there for them. And so we still have a mix of school boards that are not necessarily inclined to make a statement about immigration and about their schools being a safe place, even though they may have some, statements out there, they may have some board policies, but it's about enacting them and standing behind them in this time of this turmoil that we're experiencing. So I think one of the things that's really important is reaching out to those school boards, and you can do that through, your unions. I have helped to try to support those presidents trying to get together a committee, mobilize members to speak with school boards, and get their point across of what the support is that we need and what the students need, because they are really, in the forefront with our students, and they know the needs of the community.
Absolutely. You bring up an excellent point about boards of education that are typically do have the very high level decision making, yet they're kind of in the background and invisible. And we need to reach out to those people who are making the big decisions and step up. You gave us some great advice here. What's the big picture in your experience? What advice would you give for those who are going into the education field? It's a tricky time. It's a scary time. And what advice would you give to them?
Well, yes, any time to get involved in teaching, it's not for the weak, that's for sure. You are molding and educating our future, and that's a really important job. I think it's even more important now to make sure that our students feel that they have a voice in what's happening around them. So beyond, the support that our students need, your fellow educators need support as well. coming together, mobilizing, and coming up with ideas and working through, your unions or your school boards to make a difference that will support the community is really important. So like I said, and I think was mentioned, some of the educating of our parents are really important. Holding forums for them to be able to educate themselves, having a representative, maybe having an attorney show up and do a presentation, for example. Again, also letting them know what their rights are. And then again, having some of those plans in place. So if, there was, if ICE did come in and take away a child's parents, what are you doing with that child? Does that child have a power of attorney? What are the next steps? Because again, those things can fall on us at any given time. And then I think also, like I mentioned earlier, students aren't always going to be so forthcoming with information. And so you're going to have to use your detective skills to know and gain the trust of a student, and don't feel bad if they don't want to share with you. Because I think that, especially in this culture among immigrants right now who are undocumented, they're not sharing that information because of fear. And so we have to be very understanding, but also willing to help and put a foot forward that says, I'm a safe person. I can help you. I can try to navigate this with you, because it takes a community. And that's really what's important, and what we need to build a strong community around our schools in order to support those students.
Thank you for that. As you were talking, I was thinking about information sessions for parents and how important, and families, how important that is, and the chronic fear, juxtaposing that with the chronic fear that they're under. And so providing perhaps Zoom, if they have the technology available, and they don't have to put their names or put their cameras on, and complete anonymity to provide as many safeguards as possible. Can you talk a little bit about, in your perspective, what do you think are the complexities and the problems that you see in developing these strong responses to immigrant policies at the bigger picture, higher level?
Again, I think a lot of the complexity lies at the school board levels, because again, we have school board members who are community members who are trying to be able to show their face around the community, but also trying to navigate through what has become a very sticky political game. And so I think that's one of the things that I have found to be a great wall that's been put up, is the unwillingness for some school boards to work with the teaching staff, the support staff, the community on trying to come out and really come up with a robust plan for what we will do in reaction to the policies that are being put in place. So the big picture really is to make sure that you're first of all electing school board members that are going to reflect and support the commonalities in our community, what we're looking for, what the morals are in our community. And for our students, to create that safe space for all students, because all children deserve an education. And so we want to make sure that we're leaving that pathway open. And one of the people that can create a barrier there are the school boards. So again, and mobilizing people to not just teachers and support staff, but community members and other community groups that have similar interest, and mobilizing them to make sure that our voices are heard and our needs are being met, so that we can make sure that we can continue educating our students and giving them a quality education.
Rachel Esposito, thank you so much. Muchas gracias for everything that you do on behalf of communities that are so vulnerable at this point, and have been for many years, but it's really has amped up. So thank you for your experience, you sharing your experience, your perspectives, and you started off with hope. And so hopefully at the end of this forum, we will end with hope, because we need to hold on to that hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now we're going to turn to Gabriel Paez, also known as Gabe. So welcome, Gabriel. Gabriel is a bilingual educator who's taught in the Chicago Public School system since 2013, where he's worked exclusively in the Humboldt Park neighborhood on the west side of the city. He previously was a primary bilingual teacher, then an English language program teacher, bilingual coordinator, and now works as a middle school language arts teacher for recently arrived students to the country. Working primarily with immigrant students and families, he believes that quality public education is a right of every child, regardless of income, of immigration status, and that culture and language are inseparable from equity in our schools. Gabriel is an active member of the school's sanctuary team, as well as the chair of the Chicago Teachers Union Bilingual Education Committee, where he collaborates to develop sanctuary school trainings to better prepare Chicago schools for the current era of anti-immigrant extremism and mass deportations. He earned his BA in creative writing and political science from Florida State University and his Master's of Arts in Teaching from Dominican University. Welcome, Gabriel or Gabe. Thank you for being with us. And you wanted to say a few words as an introduction before we get into the question.
Thank you, Sonia. That was a great introduction. I really appreciate it. Hi, folks. My name is Gabe Gabriel Paez. As mentioned before, I'm a proud public school educator in this great city of Chicago. Today, I'm here to share some of my classroom experience with you guys, primarily working with immigrant students in Chicago public schools. The intention here is to empower you, the audience, with the information and resources that you need to activate your school communities in defense of sanctuary, and that all of our students are under attack at the current moment. But before diving into that, I do want to share a little bit about myself and what drives me in this very challenging field. So in addition to being a teacher, I'm also an immigrant. I'm now a naturalized US citizen, but I was actually born in Brazil. And I actually still remember when I was a little kid finding my resident alien card, which is kind of a weird moment to have as a child. And actually, part of that story is that in 1991, when my family immigrated to the United States, they tried separating my family at Miami International Airport. My mom had stayed out of the country too long and her visa had been revoked. And my brother was born in the United States. I was not. And they gave my mom a choice. They said, you could go back to Brazil with your younger kid, which was me, and leave your older child in the United States. And that's what my first introduction to immigration was, really. And thankfully, actually, an immigration agent at the airport took pity on her and allowed us to leave the airport with a court date. And we're all naturalized US citizens now. But that was my story when I started. That's what really drives me in this work. And I'm actually really grateful to share some of my background and my classroom experience with you all today. So thank you, Sonia, again, for that introduction. I think that was great.
Thank you for sharing that. That must have been a terrible experience. And this is what so many families have experienced and with not a very happy ending. So thanks for sharing that with us. Can you tell us about your school, who your students are, about your newcomer students, their experiences arriving in Chicago, and anything else you want to share about them?
Absolutely. I'd actually love to show some photos if y'all are okay with that. So here we go. Here's a little photo of my kids. Hey, I did block their identities just to protect their privacy here. You all know the moment we're in. And these are actually my eighth graders, and they're all newcomers to the country, and they're great kids. But I want to give you a little bit of context to my building. My school's in the Humboldt Park neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. It's a large neighborhood with very rich, long immigrant history, specifically known for its Puerto Rican population, but now it also welcomes people from all over Latin America. Right now, we have a large influx of people from Ecuador and Venezuela. And it's also a place of intense economic displacement and gentrification, rising rents, and the sharp economic divide in Humboldt Park is along the east-west line. My school's on the west side of Humboldt Park, known as more so the low-income side of Humboldt Park. My school has about 650 kids, and at its peak, like many Chicago public schools, it had 1,200 kids. Of our students, 89% of them live below the poverty line, 55% are English language learners, and about 100 of my students are unhoused. These are the kinds of numbers that are not uncommon at CPS schools on the south and west side. We all know the kind of city that we live in. And it's quite reflective of the reality of thousands of other schools across the country in every single state. It should be no surprise that US public schools are stressed. We're tasked not only educating children, but also as crisis management centers, violence interruption centers, as trauma counseling, for food assistance, for housing, and so much more than what we're actually built for. So within this context, my school received over 250 newcomer students in less than 2 years. Many of these families were bussed up from Texas in a nationally broadcast campaign stunt and were dropped off on streets, under viaducts, in parking lots, even in below freezing weather, many of them in shorts and flip-flops, having never experienced Midwest winters. And in other words, what we saw in Chicago was a manufactured humanitarian crisis. Maybe folks remember seeing this in the news. And our schools in Chicago were really forced to respond. Firstly, the most immediate challenge that we faced was ensuring that kids were being enrolled in school buildings. We needed to give them somewhere warm and safe to just be kids, to heal, and to begin putting together the pieces of their interrupted educations. We had and still have kids living in city shelters. We have kids living in tents and cars. We've had kids living in streets and alleyways, in dangerously overcrowded apartments, and that wasn't acceptable to us. So my union and Chicago Public Schools sent people to city shelters to directly sign up thousands of children to attend school. Most schools did a good job in receiving and registering these kids. There were some cases where families were wrongfully turned away from school buildings and corrective action had to be taken. I have students who have since moved out of shelters but are now living on the south side and take buses for more than an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, one way to get to school every single day. But their dedication to finding normalcy again, to feeling like a kid again, to learning is steadfast. Nothing will get in their way to receiving an education now that they're here. I have found it to be the honor of my lifetime to be able to offer these students the very first warm and welcoming place that they may have ever experienced in the United States. Before getting to us, they were literally in ICE jails, separated from their parents, sick and underfed after months of traveling through jungle and desert. We get the privilege of opening our arms to them, right? That is the privilege of my lifetime. And ultimately, I want to say, folks, there really is no way to summarize these kids neatly into a 15-minute talk. But I do feel compelled to share a few stories here, since you're here to listen, that have marked me for life, and that taught me that this work can literally save lives. Just a couple years ago, last year, as bilingual coordinator, I was working with an 8th grader who arrived from Ecuador. Like many, she was quiet and shy, really kind of shrinking into her hoodie as I gave her the state-mandated language screener test. But before testing, I kind of made it a habit at this point to ask kids to see if I can gauge for how I could support them with food assistance, connect them to social workers, just before giving them the test, getting to know them on a human-to-human basis. And during that conversation, she timidly told me that she needed help for a medical situation. She unveiled her deeply disfigured and unhealed left hand from her sleeve. It was raw with signs of infection. And she shared with me that in Mexico, she and her mom survived a car accident in the back of a truck where 17 people died. She survived, her mom survived. At this point, she'd been walking around school for days with a life-threatening wound, with immense trauma, and with a mother who had several spinal fractures. And no one knew, because when ICE releases these people and governors send them up here, they bring themselves here, no one actually checks in to see on their well-being. We've had many cases in my school building and in other school buildings of skin infections, of dental problems, of preventable illnesses, of parasites, of traumatic injuries, of mental trauma in our students. And we had to dig deep and work well beyond our work hours to connect these families to community organizations, nonprofits that could help them. Cook County Care, our public health care network, New Life Centers on the West Side have been instrumental in helping people in the need of the most urgent care. And in the case of my former student and her hidden injury, after many visits to the Strozier emergency room, that our staff helped facilitate. And after months of waiting and through connections with the Chicago Teachers Union, we were able to connect her to a plastic surgeon to provide her the reconstructive surgery she needed to get back on the path of being a child again. She recovered from her surgery and made it back to school in time to graduate 8th grade with the rest of the class. Now, these are very extreme circumstances, but these kids are resilient. These kids are dedicated to education. They literally walked across a continent for education. So we are here to serve them with open arms and as best as we can connect them to what they need for support.
Gabe, thank you so much for delineating and describing the dehumanizing conditions under which families and communities and children are exposed to just terrible, terrible conditions. And we should be more aware of that. In juxtaposing that with it was my fourth question for you, what keeps you hopeful and motivated? And you just talked about it, that this is the life, it's work that saves lives. And their students' resiliency and hope and wanting to be in school is what clearly drives a lot of educators and drives me as well. So thank you for sharing all of that. Can you talk a little bit about your school is a sanctuary school? What does that mean? How do you set up a sanctuary team? And can you share some examples of what it does and how you go about doing that? And any advice that you have for others who want to set something like that up?
Yes. There are toolkits for this. There are slides for this, but I'm going to give an overview as much as I can in the time that remains. So to put it simply, what the sanctuary team does is it's a dedicated group of school members or community personnel who meet regularly. It could be monthly, it could be quarterly, whatever the capacity in that individual school building. And they're tasked with setting priorities and practices that build a school's ability to defend our immigrant students and staff. Because in CPS in many school districts, we actually have DACA or deferred action for childhood arrivals, dreamers, who are teachers, who are paraprofessionals, who are all sorts of staff members who are now in limbo because we understand that they are also in the crosshairs of the Trump administration. So what does the team do? The team can do whatever the building needs the team to do, but here are some ideas. For example, we have to ensure that there's a plan if immigration enforcement is active either in the school or in the community. Someone mentioned on this call earlier that there have been instances of these teams, of these procedures kicking in to protect school buildings already happening in Chicago. Not too long ago, Secret Service agents showed up to Hamlin University at Back of the Yards on the southwest side of the city, very immigrant heavy neighborhood, to look for an 11-year-old child in the middle of a school day. Now, that's what they said, but we understand that this is part of that psychological warfare, that fear that the federal government is purposefully trying to instill in our community to drive parents and kids away from school, to push them out of sight of public view into the peripheries and margins of society, right? So what else does the sanctuary team do? The sanctuary team must make sure that admin and staff are trained on how to respond when or if ICE shows up in the school building. We cannot have panic if federal agents show up in the neighborhood or school building. We must be trained. These teams could also work on creating channels for clear and accurate information for parents and community. In our school, we have a sanctuary board in our front office where in both languages, in English and Spanish, and also in Quechua, because we have a lot of families from Ecuador, we are putting hotline numbers, we have food assistance numbers, we have shelter information. That way, parents who may not have access to internet know where to find everything in one place as soon as they come into your school building. We also know there's a lot of misinformation and panic on social media. We have to make sure parents are getting access to quality information. How do we empower our parents? Well, part of what the sanctuary team does is scheduling and publicizing Know Your Rights workshops led either by trained staff or by outside providers. Some of those outside providers in Chicago are ICER, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant Refugee Rights, the Northwest Center, the Chinese Mutual Aid Association, OCAD, Casa Central, Palenque Logan Square Neighborhood Association. There are many of these community organizations in Chicago who will come do these trainings for free in your building. We have them at least once a quarter in my school building, easily getting 45 parents per session. Something else beyond just what we think of sanctuary, something that this team can do is establish cultural community events to keep families engaged in the school despite their fear and uncertainty. That could be meals for the families, that could be music, that can be arts and crafts events, so that parents know that those doors are still open to them despite the fear that they are justifiably fearing. And then the last thing I'll say that the sanctuary team can do is preparing any parent-facing staff to register kids on the spot, connect them to STLS or unhoused resources, because many of them are unhoused or doubled up, connecting them to resources around healthcare and outside providers who can do that trauma counseling. There are just so many needs, and this is kind of a drop in the bucket that I wanted to share with y'all of what the sanctuary team can do.
Thank you for that. I think what resonates with me is that we cannot be paralyzed. There's a lot that we can do, and that we're not alone. There's a whole network of people like you and like others that are mired in this work, and the support of community organizations. We should tap into that. Are there any other comments you'd like to share? We have a few minutes.
Yes, of course. I do have more I'd like to share. So I want to share that the evening after the morning after the Trump second inauguration, we had attendance of below 50% in my school building, below 50%. And many school buildings in Chicago were below 50%. It took us weeks to get our attendance back. And that's part of its tangible wave of fear that's paralyzed thousands of families in Chicago and millions across the country. Our parents fear in a very concrete way any parent's worst nightmare, the separation from and the loss of a child. And from the child's perspective, maybe you remember being a kid and getting lost in the grocery store for 5 or 10 minutes, the panic of losing your parent for 5 or 10 minutes in a grocery store. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a child who may have a parent taken from them and never see them again. We know that in the first Trump administration, thousands of children were forcibly separated from their children at the border, and they have never been reunited with their families. That is still the case 4 or 5 years later, children who have never been reunited with their families, right? That is traumatic beyond comprehension, right? And it took weeks for schools in Chicago to get the attendance back, to getting kids back in the building. We had kids abruptly transfer out or just stop showing up. They left journals and book bags and binders full of work behind that will never be completed. And within this same period is when we started seeing these waves of very justifiable panic of ICE being on this corner, of ICE being in that grocery store, of ICE being absolutely everywhere. So this is a kind of psychological warfare to destabilize these communities that are just getting on their feet. We have to be the folks who bring calm, information, organization, right? Teamwork. This is not work to be done by yourself. I will tell you from personal experience, this kind of work takes a mental toll on you as an educator, right? So you are not in this by yourself. Tap into your social worker, talk to other teachers who are going through this. Form the sanctuary team, because if you are trying to do this by yourself, you're not going to kind of have the success either personally or professionally to actually help. If you are not well because this work is heavy, then you will not be able to assist those who need your support. So be well yourself.
Gabriel, mil gracias, obrigado, for also sharing your experiences and perspectives from the ground. In many ways, this is the work of it becomes humanitarian work. We're teachers.
Can I show one more photo before we wrap up my end?
Yes.
Okay,
please.
folks. We're gonna share the sanctuary. We're gonna share the sanctuary. Como se dice? We're gonna share the sanctuary toolkit with you guys. But I also did want to share some of these photos. This is actually a photo of Sandra Cisneros, who came to our school earlier this school year. And these are all of my 7th and 8th grade newcomers who are listening to Sandra Cisneros, the author of House on Mango Street. Funny story, Sandra Cisneros and the House on Mango Street was actually written because she grew up on the same street that my school is on. right? Mango Street's not the real name, but she grew up and wrote the book based on what it was like to grow up in that neighborhood when she was a child. So everything came full circle. Sandra Cisneros, who now lives in Mexico, was visiting us. And for 2 years, I had been nudging her agent to bring her to our school. She came, she met our 7th and 8th graders and shared some words of wisdom. This is what I mean by maintaining a sense of normalcy. These children 6 months ago were crossing the Darien Gap. Today, they're meeting Sandra Cisneros to talk to them what it means to grow up in the neighborhood. So there's so much power when we loop in our resources, when we see who's there to support, and we're proactive and nudge and nudge and nudge until we get what we need.
Thank you. And so you also end with hope. Rachel started with hope, ended with hope, and so did you. So thank you for that. Mil gracias. So we have some questions, but just as a reminder, in the chat, if you have any questions, we'll try to get to as many as possible. So Lubna, we'll start with you. Lubna and Rachel, if you can come back and join us. So a couple of questions for you. Can you address some of the current status issues with the intersection of wealth, class, and immigration status, H-1 visas, green card black backlogs, etc.? And then I have a second part to that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can see that there's a bit of a debate in the current Trump administration about what they want the contours of legal immigration in this country to look like. There are some parts of the administration that are pushing for more H-1B visas because they kind of view that as kind of the quote good immigration. And then there's other parts of the coalition that don't want any of that either because they just overall are not a fan of immigration generally, whether it's high skilled or not skilled, because they view it as potentially changing the demographics of the country. So I think there is this tension in the current administration about things like green card backlogs, family immigration. I know there's a lot of discussion among certain circles in the administration about things like what some of them derisively refer to as chain migration, which is basically when if you are in the US, you can help your family members come to the United States and get green cards, and there's people who are opposed to that. So I think it seems like overall, though, that the atmosphere is on clamping down on all types of immigration, right? Like not just that they want to close the border down, but they also want to make it more difficult for all types of people to immigrate to this country, except for potentially people who can buy this gold green card with $1 million, or I'm not sure what the amount of money is. But so it seems like once you pass a certain threshold of wealth, maybe it's okay, but for everybody else, not so much. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in on that too.
Thank you, Luna. I have a question. I'm going to come back to you, Luna, in a minute. Rachel, and anybody, do you have any ideas for teachers who are in schools that are not so sympathetic to immigrant rights, or where immigrant students might just be a relatively small number of the total student population?
I think Gabe said it best earlier when he said, this is not work that you can do in a silo. This is not something you can do by yourself. You'll get burnt out, as it is with anything in education. So really finding community groups and community members in your area that are supportive of your fight, if you will. And so I think that's really important when you are looking to make change and try to persuade school boards or other groups to help support. And it's being strategic. It's about having a plan. It's about knowing your students, knowing your community, and knowing your allies. I think that's really important.
Thank you. Gabe, did you want to add
Yeah,
anything?
I'll add to that, folks. In my context in Chicago public schools, CPS has lost almost 100,000 students in the last 10 years. What we see now for the first time in a decade is that our school populations are stabilizing, right? We know that when we lose kids, we lose positions and teachers lose their jobs. So what we're actually seeing right now is a reinvestment in the Chicago public school system, very much so because we have received 10,000 or so immigrant students in the last couple of years. Our jobs, our livelihood depend on those children showing up. I would also say where you see a lack of solidarity It's often because there is a lack of community building, right? There are tensions in our buildings. Even when there is a sympathetic teacher population, there are tensions in our student populations and our parent populations. But within those tensions, there's also bridges, right? If the bridge is food, if the bridge is music, if the bridge is church, if the bridge is art, there are bridges. Part of that work can be the sanctuary team, but the local school council should be involved. The bilingual advisory committee should be involved. The parent advisory committee should be involved. Admin should be proactive in building those bridges. Once you build bridges, you see more understanding, you see more solidarity between different populations, is what I would add.
Thank you for that.
Sorry, can I just
Go ahead.
add
Of course.
one thing here? So we have NEA members all across the country and in many parts of the country that maybe aren't so friendly to the overall issue of immigration. But we find that when it comes to immigrant children in schools, the views can be a little different because it's about children and it's about education, which is such a core value for so many people. And I think the way that you kind of talk about this issue and you talk about protecting children, protecting students, and the right to education for all, I think can really make a difference in kind of making maybe unlikely allies on some of these issues. And I also think depending on your community, if you have active church communities who can be a part of that process, I think that can be really helpful as well. We see in certain states right now that are currently trying to pass legislation to challenge the right of children to attend school, that a lot of the opposition to that has been from religious organizations and church groups in these very conservative communities. So I think that even if politically an area isn't very liberal, I think on issues relating to schools and children that you can find allies in a lot of unlikely places.
One will be surprised sometimes. We all have stereotypes about others. From the chat, the issue that scares me the most is for undocumented students with zero to little chance of citizenship because of our broken system. How do we keep students from getting discouraged and giving up? And I'll open it up to anyone.
Ultimately, I'll chime in here. Ultimately, we can't guarantee every child will stay with us, right? We just can't. The best we can do is empower communities with good information, with PD, with training, right? The best we can do is build the sanctuary team, provide a welcoming and stable environment in the school building, right? If you can bring legal clinics, that's a great one, but we cannot win every battle. So do not come into this work thinking that you are going to keep every single child in your classroom. I have lost more children than I care to share. And that's part of this work too. I will say, regardless of whether the child will ever become a citizen or get a green card or anything, or get their asylum request, they deserve a stable, kid-friendly place where they can read and write and play with their friends and just be children. Now, when we're dealing with parents, the best we can do, like I mentioned, is all that sanctuary work, the training, the flyers, the sanctuary boards. We can't win every battle, but we can sure open up the door for more folks to get the resources they need to fight, and to fight.
Very well said. Thank you. Back to Lubna or Gabe or Rachel. What advice do you have for educators who want to get involved in immigration advocacy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And there's a lot of different ways to get involved. If you have a local union at your school district, get involved with your local and your state affiliate of your union. And, if they haven't been active on these issues, encourage them to be active, to, organize to pass a safe zone policy or sanctuary school policy, get activated in that way. Other ways of getting involved, I mean, there are lots of different immigrant rights organizations in every part of the country who are, looking for volunteers, looking for assistance. And I think that's a great way to get plugged in, like mutual aid societies and organizations like that. So, first with your local union if you have one, and then there's lots of other great community organizations as well.
Thank you. Rachel, Gabe?
I would add a lot. I totally agree with what Luna's just shared there. Get involved in your union. Win those contracts that have strength sanctuary language, not just because it protects you, the employee, but also protects the school community and your students. And in the process of winning those contracts and negotiating those contracts with sanctuary language, you actually get to teach people, because a lot of people are going to read that contract who maybe don't have the background in sanctuary, but after reading your contract and hearing about the negotiations and whatever the result may be, they're going to walk away more informed. And then the second thing I'm going to say is, from personal experience, a couple years ago, I volunteered with an organization on the US-Mexico border called No Más Muertes, No More Deaths. And what No More Deaths does is they do humanitarian food and water drops along migrant routes in the Sonoran Desert, where thousands of people have disappeared. Children, parents, you find backpacks, you find all sorts of stuff out in the desert. And the reason I bring that up is because if you get the opportunity as an educator to zoom out of only your context of classroom and school building and go see it on the ground level, understand what your kids have come through, understand what your families have walked through to get to your classroom, it widens your perspective. You get to connect the dots from the border to the broken immigration system to the challenges in public education, and it goes full circle. Everything is tied into the next. So widen your scope in whatever capacity you have. That may be through a community organization, through volunteering to interpret if you speak another language. There are so many community organizations and folks who are on our side on this who are looking for volunteers, and maybe you're the right fit for that.
Thank you for that. And to part of something that we haven't discussed really, we've mentioned it, but how any ideas on responding to the socio-emotional well-being, mental health toll that you mentioned the mental health toll that it takes not just on the families and the students, but also the teachers and school leaders and others. Any advice around, we don't have enough psychologists, we don't have enough counselors, we don't have enough social workers. What do we do?
I would agree with that statement even before all this has come up. We don't have enough school support staff. We don't have enough social workers. We don't have enough school counselors. We need more people going into those fields. And we need more getting into the education, especially the pre-K, and as I represent pre-K through 12 school grades. I think that's very important, and creating a support system, not only for our students, but for our staff who are also experiencing this secondhand from our students, this trauma. And that's where the burnout comes in. So having a supportive group around you is really important, and knowing where to get those resources. Again, as staff members, as we work in school districts, we probably have a easier access to some mental health supports, but we need to make sure that we have those in place for our students as well. I know that a lot of our school districts are fighting for more support staff and personnel to have on hand for our students, because we do need them more now than we have before, for sure. Gabe, it looks like you want to add something.
Yeah, and if you think there's a shortage of social workers and counselors, think about the shortage of bilingual social workers and counselors. So if you are pre-service right now, if you're coming into the classroom, if you're bilingual, we need you. We really, really need you, like nothing else. I would say there are a few organizations and initiatives out there. The first one I want to talk about is called Strong. Strong is a curriculum that was developed specifically for newcomer refugee asylum seeking students in the U.S. school system. I've seen it implemented one time. I know there are folks who know it back and forth. It's called Strong. It's an acronym. I don't know what it stands for, but it involves small groups. It involves conversation. It involves students leading the conversation. Because we don't want to just say, give us all your trauma. We need to allow students to hear it from other students, right? So when students hear their experience reflected through other kids their age that survived, you survived and I survived, and now we're here, that's healing, right? That's strong. The last year, my school got music therapy through an organization called Chime. And what we did with music therapy is that we used our parent room and we circled up all the kids. And it was simple as shaking a shaker and all the kids doing little hand motions with different objects. And it was very interesting to see, because what it does is that it connects the neurons in a way where the trauma can subside because there's something in your hands and there's music and there's an activity. It breaks the cycle of trauma. When a child comes traumatized to school and their guard is up and they're ready and they're ready and they're ready to fight or flight, they need something that will bring down the guard, that will allow them to use their cognitive abilities fully, to engage in the classroom learning. Chime was a great experience. And something we've done quite a bit at my school, even before these children started arriving, is we started training our staff in trauma-informed practices. Some of that can be as simple as butterfly breaths. Some of that can be simple as yoga practices. There is a brain break that we do every single day in my classroom. It's like a boom, snap, clap. It's conscious discipline. It's basically another way to get kids to bring down the guard, to be conscious of what they're doing, because there's a mind-body activity, and whatever happened in the past, you can bring that down because now we're having fun while learning together. And then the last one I'll say is New Life Center here on the west side in Humboldt Park has done a really great job at helping out our families most in need, kids who need very intensive therapeutic support. We have been able to refer to New Life. They signed them up for healthcare. Thank God in Illinois, we're able to sign up undocumented children for healthcare. I don't know how I could do my job otherwise. But it's a work in progress, but those are a few initiatives that I'd like to share on that issue.
That is really, really helpful, Gabriel. What better to engage with art, music, to lower our anxiety for all of us, but especially children. And sometimes what happens in schools, or often happens in schools, is that we're giving them a menu of discrete skills, direct instruction, and just no time for the fun that you just speak of, and to enjoy art. So we are coming to the end. So how about if you all have 1 minute to say a final something? This has been so, we should continue until midnight, but we can't. Why don't we start with Lubna? Yes, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. I think I covered a lot of different things, but I think one thing that I didn't cover is making sure we are pushing back against this narrative and the way that people talk and demonize immigrants and immigrant students. And I think it's really important to, not just be aware of the protections and the ways schools can protect students, but also to push back against this narrative that that immigrants are bad or are dangerous, or that we should not have them. Because, as we all know, there are immigrants from all over the world who are enriching our schools and communities. And I think it's really important at this moment, when people and students and children are being demonized, to really firmly speak out against that. And I think there's a lot of different ways everybody talked about here to do that. But I think it was just important to put that in the room as well. And so thank you to everybody who's joined in and who's interested in this topic and who wants to help make things better for immigrant students and their families in the community.
Thank you. Rachel?
Yeah, I would add that, not everybody likes to talk about politics or get involved in politics. And I know certainly as a teacher, when I began, I shied away from politics. But I think that one of the most important things for us to do is to get involved in politics. And that would include locally looking at your school boards, as well as all the way up to our legislators, who are the ones making decisions for us who are in the classroom. And we're having to abide by what they are putting down into law. And so we want to be involved. We need a seat at the table. So it's important for us to use the systems that are in place and break some systems as well in order to make a change and make a difference. And again, checking to make sure that we do have these robust plans with not only our community members, but also making sure that we have the support systems in place, such as robust newcomer programs and all of those things that go along with welcoming our students into a place where maybe they didn't know they were going to be. So that's what I would add.
Thank you. And Gabriel?
Hey, folks. So I would just add that people need to have front and center that there literally would not be a United States or Chicago as we know it if it were not for immigrants coming to this country, building the railroads, working in agriculture, the service industry, this economy would collapse. This country would collapse if it were not for immigrant labor, right? That is the foundation of American wealth, right? That and also the long history we have of exploiting slave labor in this country, of Jim Crow segregation. This is what the current era wants to deny, the very material reality of how this country became so wealthy and how we are who we are. And this is not normal what we're in right now. Consider how extreme things have become. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, a conservative Republican, granted legalization for 3 million people plus. That's how many of my family got legal status in this country in the 1980s. And now we have an administration that is openly talking about sending US citizens to prison in El Salvador, going after green card holders because they don't like what they say for their expressing their First Amendment rights. So if they're starting with undocumented asylum seekers, and now they're going after green card holders, and then going after naturalized US citizens like myself, who do you think they're going to come for next? This is a cycle, folks. So what we're actually asking you to do, and what we're doing together in this room, is that we are prepping ourselves for the fight of our lifetime against authoritarianism in this country. We are not immune. We see it. We've seen it and we see it now. So you are part of the struggle. We're informing ourselves. We're building community. We're building sanctuary because authoritarianism is knocking at our doorstep. Thank you.
Thank you for those words. Very true. And a heartfelt thank you, really a heartfelt thank you to Gabriel, Lubna, Rachel, for everything that you do. It's not easy. It wasn't easy before, but now it's really, really difficult and challenging and heartbreaking. So thank you, Lubna. Thank you, Rachel, Gabriel. And all who took the time from your busy schedules to attend tonight's forum. And special thanks to Dr. Diane Horowitz and Maya Mushitz and Michael Boland for organizing this very timely and excellent forum. And I would like to close this wonderful forum by quoting parts of the College of Education statement in support of immigrant communities, which was approved unanimously by our faculty and staff. And this is just a short section. The College of Education at DePaul University stands firmly with our immigrant communities and reaffirms our unwavering commitment to protect and support those who are most vulnerable among us. We write as one voice, guided by the values of St. Vincent de Paul that uphold the dignity of all people. We commit to deepening our own understanding through continued faculty and staff education about immigration policy, cultural competency, and trauma-informed practices. We will continue to work toward positive systemic change through our research, our teaching, our community engagement, while actively collaborating with local organizations that protect and empower immigrant families. And with that, thank you very much for joining us today.